I am delighted and honored to be the MC for the first afternoon. My name is Claire Hankinson, and along with Dr. Chris Newcomer, I am co-chairing the conference. And again, we'd like to thank you, not only on the behalf of myself and Chris, but also our planning committee and Primer staff for joining us here. I just wanted to make a quick request. So I came from just now from lunch, an incredibly inspirational, commemorative occasion for Joan Racklin. It was absolutely wonderful, tear-jerking, lovely, amazing. And as I looked across all of the acronyms that we could actually give, some relation to Joan, there's Primer, and obviously IACUC, and I started thinking, live in. I mentioned this to Dr. Rivka Scholson earlier when I saw her acronym for RASCAL. Columbia, I thought it might be fun to do something a little bit whimsical where I would love it if someone would tell me what they think their best institutional acronym is, and we're gonna have a contest. Or let Chris know, or someone from Primer staff before the end of today, let's say, might be inspired by the wine. Because I would love to announce tomorrow morning what I think is the best acronym that you maybe could come up with. So for example, at my institution at Penn, and forgive me, Troy Hallman, who's here, he's my colleague there, a protocol system called ARIES, and then we have a satellite housing group called Shepherd. Troy did that, get it, ARIES, Shepherd. It's pretty cute, I know. Some of the ones that I've had that maybe haven't gone as well was I tried to bring our vets together for the Committee for Review of Applications and Protocols. Think about that. I did, I really did, this is a true story. And my boss is like, I don't want crap on the calendar. So, I leave that to you. If it's the satellite housing for IT, that's another one. You guys come up with what you need. So, I give you that challenge for tomorrow morning. Okay, so with that, gave everyone a couple seconds to kind of come in and take their seats. I am delighted to introduce our next keynote speaker. So Dr. John Gluck is a professor emeritus of psychology and senior advisor to the president on animal research ethics and welfare at the University of New Mexico, and an affiliate faculty member of the Kennedy Institute of Ethics at Georgetown University. Dr. Gluck trained at the University of Wisconsin in comparative psychology and experimental psychopathology. He completed his clinical psychology fellowship in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the University of Washington. He worked for many years with non-human primate models of abnormal development, with a particular interest in the effects of early experience on learning. The complexity of justifications for animal use motivated Dr. Gluck to pursue a fellowship at the Kennedy Institute of Ethics and the NIH, where he studied general bioethics, clinical ethics, research ethics, and the moral standing of animals. He was the founding director of the UNM Research Ethics Service Project in the Office of Research, and co-director of the UNM Health Science Center Ethics Institute. He is lead editor of the volume Applied Ethics in Animal Research, Philosophy, Regulation, and Laboratory Applications, published in 2002, and co-author of 2 editions of The Human Use of Animals, Case Studies in Ethical Choice, published both in 1998 and 2008. Currently, he is working on a text about ethical transformation entitled Learning to See the Animals Again, the Rediscovery of Ambivalence in the Use of Animals in Research. And again, on behalf of the Planning Committee, we are thrilled that Dr. Gluck accepted our invitation, and we look forward to his talk today. Please join me in welcoming him.
Did you pick up my notes? We were about to have a truncated talk. I'm told that it's important to let an audience know something about your values and personal attributes so that they can locate you in the context of your own ethics and your ethics and what you might be saying and what I might be saying comes from. So let me just say two things about myself. One, I grew up in a home in New York City where the animals in the house had great standing. They were important beings. They were members of the family. I can remember one incident when I was about 7, and I got into a conflict with a large Spitz named Buddy, who was my grandmother's favorite. And the result of it was that I got a puncture wound on my wrist that had me run off to the local doctor, who put a few drops of acid on the spot. And when I got back home, the incident was investigated further by my mother, and it was discovered after talking to the neighbors that I had been rough with Buddy. So I was then punished further, and Buddy got a special meal. That is a true story. The other thing I want you to know is that, as was mentioned in the comments introducing me, I am somebody who has worked as a clinician and an ethics consultant in a large health sciences center. So I'm quite aware that there are more interventions available today than they were when I started doing that work. I know that people live on the average 8 years longer since I graduated from high school. Infant mortality is down, and there are improved measures of pain control. So there are many things to be thankful for in terms of the research establishment that use both humans and animals. So I'm not an enemy in the sense of progress, but yet progress will be an issue that I'll talk about today. I think every talk ought to start with an epigram, and this is mine. That's Ed Pellegrino, who was a colleague of mine at Georgetown. Ed passed away last year. He was a physician, philosopher, and a very important ethics teacher. I like that picture of Ed because it has him sitting with his finger pointed. And what I like about that is because it reminds me of the ethics courses that I took with Ed and the number of ethics rounds that he had at the hospital, where discussion of difficult clinical cases were brought up. The finger indicates that no one who attended his courses or his meetings at the hospital were allowed to be there as pleasant observers. Nobody went to these classes or his meetings at the hospital thinking that they could sit in the back of the room and pay attention to an interesting discussion. Ed's finger pointed, when it pointed at you, you had better been paying attention to the nature of the medical issues and have begun to think about the ethical issues that were relevant to the case. Ed believed very strongly that ethics was not a hobby. Ethics was part of being a profession and a professional. And he insisted that people who worked with him adopt that perspective. So as he says in the picture, in our more trivial pursuits, it is permissible to muddle along without moral reproach. This is not the case in medicine or any activity involving the welfare of others. I'm going to identify ethics for the purpose of this talk as a process where we identify and then reduce indifference to the impact of harm, pain, and suffering on an individual's welfare. And I want to remind you that ethics is a disruptive force intentionally. Ethics is not about having a particular position and then bringing it forward until everyone agrees. It's an action of conflict, hopefully thoughtful and humane conflict. What ethical discussion requires, and here I quote from Jürgen Habermas, who wrote 2 volumes on the theory of communicative action, published in the mid-80s. In the act of speaking, we implicitly commit ourselves to truth, reason, and a form of justice. We present what we say as believable and hold ourselves out as reliable interlocutors who rely only on evidence and arguments of a kind that anyone and everyone can inspect. Absent this type of communication, what you have is mutual attempts to manipulate, which get us nowhere normally. So what makes research or animal research perilous? And I should say before I finish that sentence that I'm not here to teach. I'm here really in the tradition of Plato, who said you don't teach ethics, you simply remind people of ethics. So that's my intention today. So what do I mean about morally perilous environments in the research environment? What I mean is circumstances that exist in and around animal or human research that diverts the application of important moral imperatives, like the avoidance of harming or actively preventing harm. The principles of non-maleficence and beneficence are part of the common morality. They exist and are respected across many cultures and most morally serious people. But these principles are not absolute principles. They are, in the language of ethics, prima facie principles, which means they can be overridden. But that overriding requires justification, significant and thoughtful justification. The exercise of research itself, whether it not involve humans or animals, is perilous, and we have been receiving messages to that effect throughout the ages. I dare say that Prometheus, stealing fire from Zeus so that the human race could prosper, and the suffering that he suffered as a consequence of that thievery, having his liver eaten daily by an eagle, was a signal about the question whether there is some knowledge that perhaps might be forbidden. In the 4th century, St. Augustine reminded us that human curiosity, searching for information and knowledge, as powerful and as important as it is, also had another side to it that he called the carnal quality of curiosity. He wanted us to know or recognize that wanting to know badly enough sometimes is a passion that can occlude people's vision. Francis Bacon, in 1620, when he published his crucial text, the Novum Organon, or New Method, which was a thorough and complete explication of the experimental method and the power that it could bring to understanding nature. But at the same time, Bacon warned us not to torture nature in our experiments, because at the very least, the information you would get would not be worth the effort. And then, of course, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll. All are novels that encapsulate the idea of a science or scientist reaching beyond ethical analysis, reaching too quickly. And then, of course, there's the story of Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the warrior nuclear age, giving a lecture at Princeton in 1947, a lecture about basic physics. And somewhere in the middle of his lecture, unexpected by all seated and listening, Oppenheimer turned to his audience and said, "Scientists have sinned." Later that year, he said something similar to Truman at the White House. He said to Truman, "I feel like I have blood on my hands." Truman threw him out of the White House. He didn't want to hear any expressions of guilt by scientists who were then reflecting on whether their work actually benefited human conditions. So in science, the problem is, as Bernard Rollin, the philosopher, puts it, that science has been infected with what he calls the ideology of science, and that ideology is one where the notion is that knowledge and research are totally separated from ethics. No overlap in a Venn diagram. You have research and you have ethics. We know that that view of science has resulted in great progress, but of course also a number of unfortunate incidents. We're all familiar with the brutal dissections of animals that took place in the 17th and 16th century. The coercion of poor people for the purpose of studying disease. William Harvey, the discoverer of circulation, was so moved and pushed to understand the process of circulation that when his father died, he dissected him as part of it, as an experimental subject. Now, there are others like Craig Venter who believe something totally different. For a certain slowness and deliberateness of science, he says discovery can't wait. There's no reason. Move as fast and as strongly as possible. Perhaps it was some motivation like that that took the anatomist Edward Pernkopf from Austria to try so hard to develop a human anatomical atlas that he hoped would end up teaching generations of medical students. Pernkopf was successful, and you can see one of the illustrations on the slide, which characterized the entire atlas. Just beautiful, realistic pictures that let the construction of the human body just arise off the page. The problem was, of course, that Professor Pernkopf accepted bodies delivered to him by the SS for use in his illustrations. And in some of the earlier volumes of this atlas, which you would find in every single medical school in this country, along the borders of the plates, you will see the SS insignia to illustrate their contribution to this important educational device. Now, of course, you may be saying, well, these things, this total separation of ethics and science come from long ago. But does it? When I was on the ethics committee at the National Institutes of Health Clinical Center, where every single patient is on an experimental trial of one kind or another, we came to the ward, and the attending physician went to the members of the ethics committee saying, "Oh, we're so glad you're here," which was a surprise in itself. He said, "I have a real problem." "Well, what's the problem?" He says, "I have a patient that wants to leave the hospital. And we're right in the middle of doing a bone marrow transplant. And if she were to leave the hospital right now, she would die of 14 infectious diseases simultaneously. She has no immune system." So we went to talk to this woman, 42, 43 years old, breast cancer. She'd been in 12 clinical trials, which she described as killing her. She'd had 13 or 14 surgeries. She said, "Frankly, I've had enough. I want to go home, be with my husband and my children and my dog Irene, and to die amongst them." She was totally competent. There was no mental disorder. She knew what she would face when she walked outside that hospital. But the attending / researcher, who was a very decent person, and I had seen him save many lives, tried the best he could to get her to stay. He promised, he threatened, he did everything, and eventually she did decide to stay. And she died 2 weeks later without her family. Now, in that instant, we saw a separation of science and ethics. Because my friend, I think, was in such dire need to have another data point in this very important study that it occluded his ability to listen to the ethical pleadings of his patient. So we're not finished yet with the separation of ethics and science, or the closing of that gap. Specific issues around animal use or animal research that make it also a very perilous environment. The various roles that animals have played throughout various cultures and among different types of peoples. Animals have been gods, models of virtue, strength, vermin, pests, simple nutrition, useful for target practice, and our beliefs about them differ. Squeaky machines, as Descartes called them, autonomous beings by others, bundles of mute instinct, are all in conflict. And as a consequence, the ethical world surrounding their use is even more complicated than most human circumstances. So here's an auctioneer, a cartoon by Barsotti taken out of the New York Times. The auctioneer looking at this puppy and telling the audience, the bidding will start at $11 million. A Gary Larson cartoon, the family dog pulling a gun on the family. Hey, bucko, I'm through begging. The hunter arriving at the pearly gates. A hell of a shot, weren't you? Now I selected these very carefully because they represent several different categories that you see over and over again in humor, dealing with the animal issue in our culture. The value of the animal, assertion of rights, and revenge on humans for discounting their inherent value. There would be a lot of places to look at or to start historically, to look a little closer at the issues about animal research and ethics. I'd like to start with the Goltz-Ferrier debate in 1881. Friedrich Goltz was a neurosurgeon, a neurologist, who believed that the brain worked together as a single unit. Daniel Ferrier believed that the brain was made of compartments and all the functions were compartmentalized. So they were giving their talks at the 1881 7th World Congress on Medicine, and they brought their data with them. Goltz brought a dog with him whose brain had been lesioned, and he had the dog walk up on the stage, and the dog wandered around, seemed absolutely normal. Proof of the brain working together and injured parts being picked up by the other parts. Ferrier, on the other hand, also brought data in the form of an animal, and it was a young macaque monkey. And he brought the macaque monkey when it was his time to talk up on the stage. And it had had brain lesions thrust on it. And instead of the dog that was indistinguishable from other, quote, normal dogs, the monkey limped. It had a dense right-sided hemiplegia, had a withered arm, and it limped across the stage. You can visualize it, I know. And the neurologist Jean Charcot, who was observing this demonstration, upon seeing the monkey, he spoke out loud enough to say, "It is a patient." And in that utterance, he captured the problem. Because he used the term patient in two ways. One, the animal appeared like it could be a stand-in for a human patient. And second, that the animal had its own predicament. It was a patient in and of itself for itself, with the etymological root of the word patient meaning one who suffers. So what we have seen over the course of the next 100 or so, 150 years, is trying to find a way to have the patient of the animal meld somehow with the patient it stands for. The movement of the 3 R's in the 1940s and 1950s in the UK was an attempt to bring those two conceptions of patient together, that research could be done humanely. When I was in graduate school, I worked at the Harry Harlow Primate Center, and education in ethics was unheard of. Now, this is 1968, 69, 70, 71. And I remember very distinctly one day we had a journal club and we were reading the recent publications of the chimp Washoe and the use of American Sign Language. And the group got together and we had a hearty intellectual discussion. You know, was ASL really a language, or was it something less than a language? And were the behaviors that Washoe made, were they simple little response reward behavioral units, or was there some understanding? We were having a great time until Paul Kotler, one of the senior graduate students, said, well, I got a question. What would you do? What would we do? What would our obligations be if Washoe signed, let me out of here? Take me home. I don't want to do this anymore. I think I speak accurately when I say no one in the room except Paul saw it as an ethical question. Ethics to us at that time was clean cages, crisp apples, good food, air exchanges per hour, and veterinary care. Again, you may be saying, well, this is just the past, separating ethics out of science education. Well, in 2011, when the esteemed Institute of Medicine gave its charge to the committee that was to study the necessity of using chimpanzees in biomedical research, its charge specifically said to this group of committee members, you can't study or evaluate ethical issues, period. You are to tell us only the scientific answer to the question, are chimps necessary for biomedical research? Ethics doesn't belong in this analysis. 2011 from the Institute of Medicine. Well, on December 15th, 2011, the committee put forth its report, and one of the first things they said, page 2 as a matter of fact, you can't do a study like this without considering the ethical costs to the animals. It can't be done. So they stood for the melding of ethics and science in a very clear and unambiguous way. I think still, now that we have, as of 2011, had a very clear statement about the importance of ethics in joining scientific research, I still think there's evidence that very often when we do our applications of ethics in animal research, we do it in a fairly minimalistic way. I can't tell you how many times I made the statement or heard it made to the effect that we discovered it would be unethical to do study X with the human beings. So we did the work with animals, as if that was some sort of logical description. I mean, a freshman student in introductory psychology would know that we did not make an argument worthy of such a decision. When Carl Cohen in 1986 published his article supporting animal research because animals were not of the kind who could have rights, we adopted it, hook, line, and sinker. It was a good paper. It was a created that kind of flurry and study that they are intended to do. But many of us said, well, look at this. He's made the decision. He's discovered animals are outside, rather, the moral purview of having rights. As the years went on, of course, the strengths and weaknesses of that paper became clearer. And we, some of us, became embarrassed at being so quick to accept its premises. This is Robert Lewis. He's the governor of Zuni Pueblo, which is a pueblo about 150 miles west out of Albuquerque, where I spend most of the year. I had heard him give a talk at Earth Day once, and I thought, well, he had a very interesting perspective about the environment and animals and relationships. So I went to see him in his office at Zuni. And I talked about moral standing problems and how do we judge whether animals have standing, don't have standing, and so on and so forth. And he looked at me and he said, you know what the problem is? You white people, he said, you white people look at your feet too much. What? What do you mean we look at our feet too much? And he said, you just look at your mark on the earth. That's all that interests you, is your mark on the earth. You have to look outside of yourself and see that you're a part of a larger system of animals and plants and so on. And so he preached this, open yourself up to the connectedness of life. It was a wonderful lecture, even for us white people. The Cambridge Declaration in 2012, after a meeting of some very important neuroscientists, stated that convergent evidence indicates that non-human animals have the neuroanatomical, neurochemical, and neurophysiological substrates of conscious states, along with the capacity to exhibit intentional behaviors. And then they concluded that the treatment of animals needed to be revised. Throughout the complex debates about animal use and the ethics of animal use, many of us have at least felt that we had the moral high ground because we were studying and trying to discover cures for the suffering diseases that human beings experience. We had an assumption, many of us did, that all diseases are curable and that such progress is economically affordable. Now we see writers like Sherwin Nuland, Dan Callahan, both very astute bioethicists, health economists beginning to question whether it is true that our ambitious program of discovering disease is in fact economically viable. They question it. They say the numbers don't add up. And they bring to our attention the possibility that our good intentions in animal and human research really will undermine the health system that we intend to advance. A few conclusions. We have to get the PH back in the PhD. Science and medical education can't be hobbyists when it comes to ethics. They have to be professionals in ethics. We have to expand our knowledge of how animals can be harmed. There was a study published just the other day that showed that rats, mice living in ventilating cages that got the air from the top had fewer anxiety symptoms than rats that got their cages ventilated from the side. Who would have predicted that? Important types of research, identifying the hazards and the harms. How can we benefit animals? There's a big movement in human research about how to benefit the research subject. How can we do it? We see elements of it, rehoming, retirement, but certainly the search for alternatives. Finally, I think we need to support the construction of a Belmont report for animals. The Belmont report in 1978 did the world of good for human research in this country because it provided principles on which to begin specifications about acceptable behavior. The 3 R's are very important, but they're not principles, they're guidelines. So what we're seeing is that the animal issue is broadening before our eyes into areas that perhaps are even more difficult than the ones we've been struggling with. Thank you for your time. Do we have time? We have time for some questions or comments or water. Well, I'm going to hang around. I'm going to hang around, so if you'd rather, oh, we have a question.
Thanks very much, Dr. Gluck, for your very inspiring and interesting talk. I'd be interested to hear your comments, some reflections on what happened with the chimpanzee report from IOM and how NIH responded, and really how the whole thing came from the Alamogordo primates, or the chimpanzees. And I know that you were very involved in that directly, so I'd love to hear your comments on that.
Well, the chimp committee being asked to study the necessity of their use in biomedical research, you're right, started with the intention of NIH to move 172 chimpanzees that had been living in more or less retirement at the Alamogordo primate facility on the Holloman Air Force Base in Alamogordo, New Mexico. And I have to say, you know, it was one of those incidents where I started to feel some confidence in the political system. I went to see Jeff Bingaman, who was the senior senator at the time, and I was just absolutely amazed about how carefully he was in his listening to the arguments about where ethics belonged, where it didn't belong, and so on and so forth. So eventually, he decided ethics did belong in science and moved the process from that point. I think perhaps had that not happened, that very groundbreaking, pathfinding report never would have been done. I'd be happy to talk to you about more details if you'd like. Thank you very much.
So I really would like to thank Dr. Gluck for sharing your thoughts with us, your perspectives, and I think really embracing what we'd hoped your talk would be, which was to personally challenge each of us to think about the lens of ethics that we put into our daily work. So with that, I'd like to announce the break. We are going to reconvene with the next panel, panel 2, at 3 p.m. So those panelists and moderators, if you can make your way to the front while the rest of us take a quick stretch break, we'll begin promptly at 3. Thank you.